Okay, welcome to Behavior Bytes, everyone. This is our little coffee break in the middle of the day. And today we are going to be talking about supports for classroom management. I am Shonda Talene, and I will be providing your content for the next hour. And I am being supported by Nicole Holland Sims. She'll be managing our chat room. And Tara Russo will also be providing support for us. So I just want to start off by talking about the mission of Patton. So our mission is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to support and serve students with special needs. Our goal is for each student to be educated in the least restrictive environment through the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. And we always want to make sure that we put our mission and our commitment up on the upfront so that we all know that we're on the same page. So before we start, we want to just talk briefly about some of the functions in Zoom. Everyone is muted upon entry, and if I don't think there would really be a reason to unmute, but Tara would be unmuting you if you needed to talk. This session is being recorded just for your information. We will be utilizing the chat. So number 6 is the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So if you had a question or a comment, you could definitely utilize that chat function. I also wanted to put your attention to number 4, the participants button. So if you could go ahead and click on your participants button, and Tara, if you can kind of monitor this for me. I just wanted to make sure that you knew the participant buttons, because there will be a few times I'll ask for your feedback. So you can use the participant button to indicate, to raise your hand, to indicate yes or no, to go slower, go faster. Hopefully I keep a perky pace for all of you. You can also select the more button to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. There's hands clapping. That'd be great to see some hand claps. Give me some feedback. If you're gonna step away for the moment, we don't really need to know, but if you wanted to let us know, you could just select that clock and it would tell us that you're stepping away for a moment. All right. In order to access the materials, and if you look in the chat box, the link to the materials will be there, and you can copy and paste that in another window in order to access the materials. So the materials for all sessions are accessible with this tiny URL, but the one specifically for today is the 5/5/2020 supports for classroom management. If you want to go ahead and open that folder, we will be referring to the materials that are inside, and the PowerPoint, the PDF version of the PowerPoint is located in there as well. So for today, we wanted to make sure that we are modeling what we are expecting. So this is our matrix for today. We won't be using breakout rooms, but we will be using the whole group Zoom room. And our expectations are for us to be acting in a respectful and responsible manner. So like I said, you're muted upon entry. If you do have your camera on, just to be aware of your background, we always encourage the use of a virtual background. If you want to keep your camera on, use the hand raise function. If you want it to verbally share, please use the chat function if you have questions. If we were to do participant discussions or to take a question, we would unmute you ourselves. All right. So here we go. This is our agenda for today. So within this hour, we'll talk about why classroom management is a needed component to a successful educational program. We'll be talking about the critical components to an evidence-based classroom management plan. We'll talk about some resources that are available. So I'll walk you through a couple of resources. And then finally, what should be considered when you're implementing? When I looked at the registration, I know that we have teachers, we have administrators here, people who are in very different roles. So we want to make sure that we thought about what would it be like to implement as an individual, and also if you were an administrator or if you were in charge of your entire district. So before we start, Tara is going to administer a short poll for us, and there are 2 questions. So I wanted to know if you're required, or if you're an administrator, do you require your classroom teachers to complete a classroom management plan? And you can just make your selections. And then if you do complete classroom management plans, what sort of supports are provided to you? Is there a standard template? Do you have resources given to you to help develop your plan? Professional development opportunities? Is it A and B, or all of the above? So I'll just give you a few seconds to complete the poll, and we can see that our results are changing. So we'll give a few more seconds. We have almost half of you have participated, 37% actually is what it's telling me. So as I'm looking at the results, I'm seeing that it's pretty much a 50-50 split between if you are required or not required to complete a classroom management plan. So that's good to know. And then I'm seeing that about 35% of you who are completing classroom management plans are being given supports in the form of a standard template, resources to develop your plan, and professional development. Some of you are being given less. So hopefully, as we go through this time together, we can introduce you to more supports and some plans that you can use to make this a little bit more robust process for yourself. So why is classroom management important? When we're looking at student achievement, that is a goal that we want for all students. We want them to grow. In order for that to happen, we think of effective instruction. Instruction is usually our first go-to. And when we're thinking about effective instruction, we are thinking about robust lesson plans, strategies that we're utilizing. But we also have to think about classroom management. We have to be intentional about both of those in order to have effective student achievement. I don't know how many of you have ever experienced a class where you have had students who are committing behavior errors, and how difficult that is to carry on your instruction. So what we hope to come from this is that people will start to see how important it is to plan intentionally and strategically for classroom management in the same way that we're planning for effective instruction. So also looking at data, we do have a problem with maintaining teachers. So when we look at several research studies, they're showing that roughly 12% of public school teachers leave the field within the first 2 years. So not just their building, but the field within the first 2 years. And 50% are leaving within the first 5 years. So if you've been an educator for more than 5 years, we want to thank you for sticking with it. I see smiles out there. So if you're thinking about these numbers of 12% of public school teachers leaving in the first 2 years, 50% leaving within the first 5 years, think about what implication does that have for you in your current role. So what implication might that have for you as an administrator, as a classroom teacher, as a parent, if you also have children in the education system? And then also think about how would that affect students as well. When we look more closely at the data, some of the most consistently listed factors for teachers deciding to leave the field are lack of pedagogical training, the school environment, and poor student behavior or motivation. Now, luckily, these are all alterable factors. These are things that we can address through a myriad of ways. Looking even more closely, specifically, teachers are consistently reporting that they felt they had inadequate pre-service training in classroom management prior to becoming a teacher and educator. And then once they're in the field, that they felt there was a lack of support and training for handling student behaviors. So what we see is that we do have issues, and that one of the ways that we can address this is through classroom management plans and learning about classroom management practices. So of course we have to show you our multi-tiered systems of support. We have to show you the triangle with all of our trainings. So when we think about classroom management, that does fit in with PBIS if you are a building that is implementing PBIS, or even if you're not implementing PBIS, classroom management has a definite place within your classroom. So when we're thinking about the 3 tiers, this doesn't only apply to the whole system of your building, it also applies to the system of the classroom. And a classroom management plan is really a tier 1 practice. And if we think of tier 1 practices, remember these are the practices that all students experience just from entering your classroom. So when you have a classroom management plan, it is helping you with preventing behavior problems or behavior errors from occurring. It can also be a tool for remediation if students are having difficulty consistently meeting behavioral expectations, and it can also be an opportunity for accommodation for students. So as we think about the classroom system and the fact that your classroom management plan is a tier 1 practice, if you know anything about the triangle, we typically say that roughly 80% of your students should respond to your tier 1. The same is true for your classroom management plan. So if you are a teacher who's been implementing a classroom management plan and maybe 2 to 3 of your students in your class aren't responding to it, that doesn't mean that your classroom management plan isn't effective. That might mean that you might need to think of supports for small groups of students at tier 2 within your classroom system, or something more individualized within the classroom system for those students who aren't responding to your general classroom management plan. So the reason I like to talk about that is if you're an administrator or you're talking to a peer and they are concerned that their classroom management plan isn't touching all students, that's not atypical, because we're really thinking about it touching roughly 80% or more. The more that you understand your students and practices, of course, that number can increase. So we're now going to talk about critical components, and we do know what works. So there have been lots of studies around practices that have been shown to have positive outcomes for students, both behaviorally and academically. And those have been gathered through a meta-analysis to identify 5 critical features of evidence-based practices that have been shown to have positive outcomes for students. So if we look at those, maximizing your structure, establishing, teaching, and monitoring positively stated rules and expectations, actively engaging students in instruction, establishing a continuum of consequences to increase appropriate behavior, and then finally establishing a continuum of consequences to decrease inappropriate behavior. One of the things I want you to note with these practices is that practices 1 through 4 are all focused on prevention. Only practice 5 is focused on responding to student behavior. And that's because what we want our energy to be spent on is that prevention aspect, and only a minimum of time spent on responding to student behavior. Another way to think about this is the 80-20 rule. And I like this graphic because it helps teachers, administrators to just think about your practice and what are you spending your energy on when you're in the classroom. If you're spending more than 20% of your time redirecting students, responding to behavior errors, writing office discipline referrals, that's an indication that there might need to be more time focused on planning for prevention and thinking about those preventative practices of maximizing structure, looking at expectations, acknowledgement of students meeting expectations, and acknowledgement of a continuum of strategies to acknowledge appropriate behavior. So that's just an indication, if you're spending more time responding to behavior errors, that we might have to go back to the drawing board with that classroom management plan. This is just another graphic to think about that. We're spending the majority of time with the prevention. And I like this one because it talks about effective instruction. If a student is effectively engaged in instruction, it's very difficult for them to also be completing behavior errors. If students are feeling successful academically, if they're feeling confident academically, if we're able to utilize strategies that allow all students to be successful, there would be less opportunities for them to engage in behavior errors, and you should be spending less time intervening. Okay, so here are some key questions that you can think about as you're thinking about the design of your classroom management plan. Now, some of you said that you had classroom management templates that you utilize. So as I'm going through these key questions, I want you to think about the classroom management template that you're using to think about, does my classroom management plan, the way that I have it created, answer these questions? Okay, so the first question is around foundation. So these foundational practices, this is what you think about, this is what you plan for before your students hit the door, okay? So have you considered the physical design and layout of the classroom? And this includes both those visual and those auditory distractions that can happen in the classroom. So have we planned for that? Have you developed predictable procedures and routines, and have you put those in writing for both teachers and students? Have you developed and posted your classroom rules? And one of the things we like to talk about with classroom management plans is that your 3 to 5 positively stated rules would be the same as your school-wide rules. They wouldn't be different for the classroom. So if your school-wide rules were, we are ready, responsible, and respectful, those would also be your classroom rules. The way that you can delineate your expectations for the classroom would be through the creation of a classroom matrix. And I'm going to show you a little bit later what that looks like. But your matrix is what being ready, respectful, and responsible will sound like and look like within that classroom setting. So that's your opportunity to really make it fit your setting. So those are foundational practices that you consider before your students hit the door. Once your students are within your classroom, we then ask the question, am I using proactive and positive classroom management practices consistently? And consistently is the key word, because remember, we said we know what research tells us works, but we want to know, are we using those practices every day with our students? So are we providing students with high rates and varied opportunities to respond to instruction? And that's where those effective instructional practices play a part. Are we moving from the practice of just calling on volunteers and instead to expecting all students to respond using techniques such as choral responding, partner responses, etc.? Are we using prompting and active supervision? So are we doing things like pre-correcting before behavior errors occur? Are we using active supervision techniques such as scanning, proximity to students, and interactions with students? And then finally, are we acknowledging when students are meeting our behavior expectations? I was having a conversation earlier today about sometimes we forget to acknowledge when students are meeting our expectations because we might be thinking it, or we just might be expecting students to meet those expectations. But we do know that it's important to maintain that 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative, so students are hearing more often that they are meeting our expectations, so that there is a higher likelihood that they continue to do so. And then finally, the last question is around data. So are we collecting data, and do those data indicate that students are continuing to engage in problem behaviors, or are they meeting my expectations? So one of the first things to think about, do you have a goal for your classroom? What are your expected levels of student behavior for the context of your classroom? And that's usually where you would need to start to think about, are students meeting my expectations? So you can use things like historical data, where you can use your current data in order to create a goal. And your goal is going to tell you what you're expecting to see by when. So for example, you might have a goal around within classroom transitions. And your goal might be students will complete within class transitions within 3 minutes by the end of October and maintain that level or lower for the remainder of the year. So it's important to have a goal so that you understand how am I going to use my data and, you know, look at the student's progress. You can also collect data systematically. So think about the data that you already collect within your classroom. So if you do minor behavior referrals, if you want to look at transition times, if you want to look at the percentage of homework completion, the percentage of assignments that are completed within timelines, you can first think about the data that you're already collecting in your classroom and seeing how you can utilize that to manage student behavior before you think of new ways to collect data. So within the folder, the classroom management folder, and we'll put the link back into the chat if some of you joined us after we showed you the link before. But if you look at the Behavior Bytes Coffee Break folder within supports for classroom management, there is a folder within that folder that says blank template and completed examples folder. So I'll give you a second to open that. And what you'll find in there is a blank template, and I'm going to take you through the template right now. But there are also some completed classroom management plans. So there are 2 completed classroom management plans for elementary age teachers. There is a completed classroom management plan for those of you who might be teaching the middle grades. And then finally, there is a completed plan for high school. So these are actually classroom management plans that I got from teachers who are in the field. I was helping another district implement classroom management plans district-wide. So these are actual plans that teachers have created. So you can see some differences in the different plans. So once we go through the template at your leisure, you can take some time to look at the completed examples. So one of the reasons I like this classroom management plan template is because it aligns with those practices that we just went over, and it does help you to answer those questions that we just talked about. So the first question was, are the foundations of effective classroom management plans in place? So I'm just going to use this laser pointer. So when we look at the foundations, remember we talked about having classroom rules. So the template gives you a space to write those rules, which are the same as your school-wide rules. And it also has a place for you to create what's called a classroom matrix. And so that's basically listing your classroom rules. And then you can talk about what does that sound like and look like during whole group instruction, during small group instruction, during independent work, during transitions, but you can make this fit your context. It also identifies methods for teaching expectations, because we know that students aren't going to automatically understand our expectations. So we want to make sure that we put in our template, how do we plan to teach those expectations? This section is for what is the general layout of your classroom. Some teachers take pictures, some teachers draw diagrams, some teachers do verbal descriptions of what they want their layout to look like. There's a spot for talking about your attention signal, for having your daily schedule. So these are all thinking about those foundational practices and how are we articulating those in our classroom management plan. One of the things I want you to note is wherever it says resource in blue, those are actual links. So this classroom management template has links embedded throughout it. So if you are thinking, how am I going to set up a classroom matrix? I really don't understand what that is. You can click on one of the resources and it'll take you to a document, or it'll take you to a short webinar that will give you more information about that specific section of the classroom management template. And those are embedded throughout the entire document. Next, remember, this is what we talk about when students come into the door. So what are the proactive and positive classroom management practices I'm implementing consistently? So on the previous page and this page, there's a spot for you to write out your student and your teacher routines. So for your student routines, how do I ask for help? How do I ask to sharpen my pencil, etc.? For teacher routines, when do I correct papers? Am I greeting students at the door? So we're just talking about these specific routines, and we know that there's infinite routines. So as you're writing your classroom management plans, you might want to think about, what are the routines that I need my students to know right away from the get-go, and you can slowly add additional routines to your classroom management plan. And then once again, what's your plan for teaching those? Okay, so we want to teach and reteach those routines for students and for the teacher. And another great thing to have it in writing is if you have a substitute. What I found, a lot of feedback I got from teachers who were implementing the classroom management plans, they talked a lot about how it helped them when they had substitutes in their building. And they were able to give students the same experience even when they weren't in the classroom. Finally, there is a section for acknowledging appropriate behavior. So what's your plan for acknowledging the whole group, small group, and individual students? And then this section talks about, what are my procedures for discouraging problem behaviors? So those preventative procedures are really talking about your plans for effective instruction. So how are you going to utilize things like choral responding? How are you going to utilize processes like universal design for learning, et cetera, in order to prevent behavior by utilizing effective instructional practices? And then finally, in this section, how am I going to respond to student behavior? So we know that behavior errors will occur. So how am I going to plan to correct those? And we want our corrections not to necessarily focus on punitive practices, but we want to think about those proactive solutions like reteaching expectations, increasing acknowledgement for specific areas or specific times. So these sections of the classroom management plan are all talking about what's going to happen once the students hit my classroom. And then finally, there's a section that deals with data. So remember, we talked about having goals, knowing what your expectations are. So there's room to have a short-term goal. So what do we expect immediately? And then maybe a longer term goal that might include behavior. It can include academic behaviors. It can include student outcomes as well in terms of how they're meeting those benchmarks within your classroom. So you can put all of that in the goals section. And then there is a section for, how do you plan to collect data? So how often will I collect data to support if students are meeting my goals? What data will I collect? Remember, we want to start with those data that we're already collecting. And then how often am I going to review progress? So a lot of times one of the lessons that we learned when we were implementing classroom management plans is that when teachers were meeting in their team meetings, that was always a good time for them to sit with their grade level team or their department and talk about, how are students responding to classroom management plans. And remember, if you all have questions, the chat box is open for you, and we have folks manning the chat, and I'm happy to answer questions about what you're seeing up here. Along with the template, there is a rubric. So remember, this is an example of a template. This is an example of a rubric that aligns with the template that I just showed you. So this rubric is based on the Danielson framework. So those indicators that you're used to seeing, and it's utilizing those same anchors that you see when you look at the Danielson model. So this rubric can be used in several ways. You can use it for yourself. So as you're creating your classroom management plan and you want to look at how you're developing it, you can look at the rubric to see, am I in that range of proficient? I had another district that they always had peers look at their classroom management plans. They were completing them as a grade level team together, or they were completing them as a department together. So you don't have to complete your classroom management plan in isolation. So the teams that I was supporting, they completed them together because they wanted students to have some consistency as they were moving from teacher to teacher throughout a grade level or through various departments. So they did before they implemented their classroom management plan. Sometimes they would have their peer give them feedback on their classroom management plans. And then finally, if you are implementing this district-wide or it's a building level expectation, administrators utilize the rubric in order to provide feedback to classroom teachers with the expectation that 80% of their classroom management plan should be in that proficient level or higher. So they were utilizing it for feedback. Okay, and you do have access to the rubric. It is in the Classroom Management Behavior Byte folder. There is a second folder that's called Rubric and Feedback, and so the rubric is located in there. If you just want to look at it while you're creating your own classroom management plans, or if you wanted to utilize it in conjunction with the template that I just showed you. Okay, so we've talked about why classroom management is important. We've talked about those classroom management practices that are evidence-based, that show positive outcomes for students. I've shown you a classroom management template. I've shown you a rubric. So now we're going to shift and talk more about what should you consider when you're thinking about implementation. So I'm thinking more about building-wide implementation or district-wide implementation. And so as I'm going through this, I'm going to talk to you about some lessons learned, right? So here's some key questions. So we always want to have questions to ask ourselves as we're thinking about these new practices. So are foundational systems in place to support the practice of implementing classroom management plans? Do all staff know what classroom management practices to implement? And if so, are they doing it accurately? And do our data indicate that staff are implementing classroom management plans effectively? So these are some of the questions to ask when you're in that process of implementation. So whenever we think about implementing something new, this isn't necessarily going to be a quick change. When I worked with a district that was implementing classroom management plans, we really, our first 3 years were learning years for us. Our first year, we worked more on the foundational systems. So we adopted the classroom management plan template. We adopted the rubric, we created that. We also realized that our teachers weren't necessarily going to understand or know the effective classroom management practices to put in place. So the first year we had offered sessions for staff that were not mandatory. It was up to you if you could come, but we still had the resources embedded with the template. And what we learned from that process is that we needed to be more strategic about professional learning. So we did have the classroom management plan implementation did become a district priority. There was training for administrators on the classroom management template, the practices, the rubric. We had them practice looking at classroom management plans so that they could provide effective feedback. We made sure that there were resources available to support implementation of a classroom management plan. And every year at the end of the year, we looked back at those resources to determine, were they enough? Were the classroom management plans meeting expectations? And also hearing from classroom teachers about, did this feel like a useful tool or did it feel like one more thing? So we were constantly evaluating the implementation process. And then was there integration into practices? So if you are a building that's utilizing PBIS, how could this fit into your PBIS practice? For the teams that I was supporting, they utilized looking at classroom management plans as part of their tier 1 practice. So this was an agenda item that they talked about when they met as a team. And also they had a district level team in place. And so at the district level, we talked about classroom management plan implementation and support. So foundational systems, that's important to get in place as you're building this implementation process.
Hey, Shonda, it's Nicole. Quick question from the chat. Jacqueline said, when data is being reviewed, are you looking at data collected by individual teachers or school-wide data collected through something such as SWIS?
Okay, that's a great question. So when you're looking at your classroom management plan, you're collecting data on the individual goal that you set for your classroom. So the way we saw teachers do it is they would individually look at their data that they collected on their classroom. And remember, you're creating that plan in section 10 of the template that says, these are the data I'm going to collect. This is how often I'm going to collect it. And then I'm going to review that data based on the goals that I set for my classroom. That was the first step. And then what I saw is that when folks met with their grade level teams or they met with their departments, they went through their classroom management plans and their data monthly. And they talked about how students were responding, especially if they were sharing students. So it started at the individual level and then it went to that teaming level is typically how I saw it. There could be some talk of data overall at the, like looking at Swiss data as part of outcomes to see the effectiveness of classroom management plans. I hope that answered your question. Was there another question, Nicole? I saw the chat lighting up again.
There was just one other question, and I think she's okay, but it was about how do you tailor classroom management approaches for grades like kindergarten or first grade? And I said that potentially reaching out to the behavior IU TAC to help tailor that for them would be an option. Did you have anything else to add?
That is one of the things I was going to say. So one of the tools that there's a resource link to is the tool supporting classroom behavior. And I'll go back to that and show you what that looks like because it was up here. So this document, supporting and responding to classroom behavior, that is linked in that classroom management template. And that document breaks down those practices at the elementary level. So as kindergarten, middle school, and high school. It includes examples and non-examples. It has videos embedded. So that's a really good resource for you to start. But I would also talk about reaching out to your IU TAC. And that was one of the things I was going to say. If you wanted to know more about classroom management, a great place to start if you are implementing PBIS would be your PBIS team, your school psychologist. I'm a school psych by trade, so I'm always gonna, be pushing, talking to your school psych, but also your IU TAC. They're great resources for classroom management practices. Anything else, Nicole?
Nope, all good. Thank you.
All right, thank you for those questions. I'm sure other people were thinking them, and so I'm glad we got to talk about it. So the second question to think about with implementation are, do all staff know what classroom management practices to implement, and then are they doing it accurately? So, and this goes back to your professional learning plan. And it can be your district level professional learning plan. It could be your classroom or your school-based professional learning plan. And I'm going to show you a resource that administrators can use to talk about differentiated support for professional learning for classroom management, or really any topic, but we're just applying this to classroom management. So one of the things that we learned when we were implementing is, remember we said year one, we did some sessions, they were in the summer and they were kind of, if you would like, 2 sessions. Following that, the feedback that we got about the accuracy and the professional learning was that teachers felt like they needed more support. So after that, we made it mandatory that mentors, so if you were being part of induction, if you were a mentor, you would take the classroom management practices session. If you wanted to be a team leader, if that was a role within your district, those would be persons who were in those leadership roles within your school setting would take that classroom management session so that they could provide support to peers, to mentees if they were in the role of a mentor. And we also provided additional support to administrators so that they had the skills necessary to help coach and provide feedback as well. So it's important as you're thinking about implementation that we're consistently evaluating and thinking about the needs that we have for staff. One of the things is performance feedback. In the folder for the rubric and feedback form, there is a there is a document for administrators to provide feedback on classroom management plans. And that was an expectation with implementation that all teachers would submit their classroom management plans to their really to their peers first to get that peer feedback. And then their administrator would look through the classroom management plans just like they would look through a lesson plan and provide feedback. And if they saw that teachers weren't 80% in that proficient level on the rubric, 80% or more of their areas, they would think about then what type of support do I need to provide for professional learning? So do I have a large number of teachers? I'm going to go on to the next slide. So, and this goes, do data indicate that staff are implementing classroom management practices effectively? So as principals are looking at the actual classroom management plans, as they're doing their walkthroughs, as they're looking at those outcome indicators such as office discipline referrals, they can make decisions on the professional learning that might be needed within their building, okay? So if you look at this multi-tiered framework for professional development or support, at tier 1, you can look at universal professional development through training and self-management. So you might have teachers utilizing self-management or using self-learning to increase their skills. That's one way to approach it. You could also use coaching or mentoring, maybe in conjunction with self-management to support professional learning around classroom management. And then you might do peer support, so generalized grade level teams, or you might use a PLC model to support classroom management. There's lots of ways that we can utilize that based on what the data indicate. So on the this side of the triangle, it is just looking at different data sources that could be utilized in order to determine if we're receiving the outcomes that we're expecting with the implementation of classroom management plans, building-wide or district-wide. So universal screening data, if you're utilizing that, walkthroughs, student data review, and that could be at the building level or it can be at the team level. And then looking at progress monitoring as well. Teacher collected data, and that goes back to creating those goals within your classroom management template, and then going back and reviewing those goals. So one of the things that the district, one of the lessons learned from the district that I implemented with is year 1, we didn't really talk that much about coming back around to the classroom management plans, but a lot of teachers were saying, can we revisit this at the middle of the year? Can I change my classroom management plan? And so we understood that what we had to do was create more structured opportunities for teachers to revisit their classroom management plans and giving them permission to change it as your data indicate, because it is a living document. And it should be modified based on the needs of your students. And the only way we're going to know the needs of our students is if we're looking at our data. So this is just an example of a professional development support. And then finally, I want to just show you some more administrator resources that are available in the folder. So this is an example of the feedback form that I discussed earlier. So this basically is every person's name, the date that the administrator reviewed it, their percentage of proficiency. And this is not tied to evaluation. This is just to help administrators understand support. What type of support might I need to provide for professional learning? Because remember, way back when we talked about some of the reasons teachers leave the field is because they don't feel like they're getting support with classroom management. So this document is to help understand how to support the implementation and use of those classroom management practices. So down here at the bottom, the total number of instructional staff, the number of plans submitted, the percentage of those rated 80% of higher, and those that need revisions. And then what is the plan for support? So do we need to support all staff? So does that mean there's a high number of teachers whose classroom management plans didn't meet that proficiency level, which is might be an indication that they're not aware of the classroom management practices that are out there, or they might need more support with that. Is it a small number of teachers where we might want to group them in PLCs or think about grade levels or departments for support? Or do we need more intensified individual supports? This is just an example of possible data tools for collection, and these are actual links. This is links to classroom management self-assessments that are available, to possible walkthrough tools, etc., that can be utilized to help gather data, systemic data for collection and individual data for review. And then this is a document in there that just talks about what are different levels of support and how might that look within my building or my district. And it does start out with that universal level of support for all, that supplemental level of support, and then finally that individualized level of support that could be available to implement classroom management. So we've talked a lot about templates, resources, practices, possibilities for implementation. And just remember, this is a quick bite of behavior. If you want to know more about classroom management implementation, you can reach out to your IUTAC. I know you can also reach out to us here at Patton. We have resources. There's lots of online modules if you want to engage in self-learning, but there are lots of opportunities to learn more about classroom management. And before I kind of wrap us up, are there any other questions in the chat, Nicole, or are we good?
At this point, there are no other questions, but it just lit up, so maybe so. Okay, no, we're all good. No questions.
Okay, awesome. So if you do have questions after this, there is going to be a slide where you can email us questions, which is perfectly fine. So I do want to bring your attention to our upcoming behavior bites for the next 4 weeks and those topics. So if you haven't registered for one of these topics that interest you, there's still time. And as always, we want you to just remember that this is just a bite of behavior, and we look forward to your continued participation in this series. If you'd like to reach out to us, here are our lead contacts, and you can always email questions to behavior@patton.net. So thank you once again for spending time with us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.